Hi everyone, Ethan here. Today I'm going to talk about membrane potentials and electrochemical gradients. But before I do, I want to tell a story, and in doing so, answer a question. Why did I pick this topic? The answer is one, we learned about it in class because we're covering cell biology, but two, I have a personal interest slash fear slash fascination with electricity that was caused by a very embarrassing personal experience. And before we talk about this topic, I want to talk and share that embarrassing experience with you all. Let me set the stage. It's Saturday night, 1 a.m. I'm back in college, right? And I'm in my dorm room and I'm hungry. So I go to my trusty midnight snack of choice, which is a banana. I eat the banana, and then as I finish the banana, I am struck by this spontaneous desire to do push-ups. Why? I have no idea, but I want to do push-ups. But there's one problem. There's no space to do push-ups in my dorm room. It's a 90 square foot dorm room. Here's a very horrible drawing of my dorm room. This is what it looks like. There's not much space because I have junk on the floor. So I had to figure out how am I going to do push-ups. Well, I'm a clever individual. What do? Bed and desk are about level. You only need to put your feet and hands down to do a push-up. Let's do the push-up on the bed and desk. So I say, great, okay, let's do the push-up. But remember, I was eating a banana. So I got to put the banana peel somewhere because I'm lazy. I had to put it on the desk. But the desk kind of has to be clear, right? Because I need space to do push-ups on the desk. So I decided to put the banana on the side of the desk, which happens to be where my phone charger was. So then I do my push-ups, wrap up. I said, okay, my phone's about to die. I better charge it before I go take a shower. I go to charge my phone. I look at the phone charger. Turns out there's little pieces of banana fiber in that little charger port. What do I mean by banana fiber? These little like fibril parts of a banana peel. Those from the peel somehow got inside that port, probably because I put the peel on top of the charger port. So I'm like, oh my gosh, I got to dig these out before I plug in the phone. I don't want to mess up the phone. So I grabbed the closest implement near me, which happened to be a mechanical pencil. I use a mechanical pencil, sort of dig into the port, take out the fibers. Once they're out, I said, okay, I plug in the phone. And I went to go take a shower. I come back from the shower to a truly horrific scene. My phone is genuinely aflame. It is on fire. This is actually what was happening. Okay, maybe not as fiery as the gift, but it was on fire. So I am panicking. I start blowing on the phone. I unplug the charger. Thank goodness the fire wasn't great. And I took a fast shower, I guess, because I was able to blow out the fire. And thank goodness also the smoke alarm was not triggered. And I just want you to sort of imagine the scene here, right? You've got Ethan returning from the shower at 2 a.m, right? Damp from the shower. I'm cursing like a sailor as I blow on my flaming cell phone, all caused by an incident involving a banana, push-ups, and a pencil, right? This was a new low, even for me, all right? Even for that guy, this was a new low and a truly absurd scene. Then I had to send a very embarrassing email to my friends about the incident, and I had to, of course, figure out why. I talked to engineering friends. It turns out graphite array conductor probably conduct electricity, lit the remaining bits of banana or the battery, and there was that. So yes, that was my ridiculous, embarrassing story. What was the point of that? The point was to say, don't put bananas on top of your charger, don't mix graphite with electricity, but also this gave me a natural interest slash fascination slash fear of electricity. So when we covered this in class, I was interested, I learned more, and I just figured, you know what? Let's present about it today. So before we talk about membrane potentials, electrochemical gradients, all of that, I want to break up that idea of electrochemical gradients into component parts, electric and chemical. The first part of that gradient I want to talk about is the chemical gradient based on concentration gradients. Let's say you have a cell, glucose, 100 molar inside, 1 molar outside. What does the cell want to do if you open a pore that's open to glucose? That's right. Glucose wants to leave the cell. That's a concentration gradient. That's diffusion. That's one part of electrochemical gradient. These concentrations want to equilibrate. The other part is electric. Let's say you have a cell, 100K plus ions inside, 99K plus ions outside. What's the membrane potential or net charge inside the cell compared to outside? Because remember, membrane potential is always calculated intracellular in comparison relative to extracellular. That's right, membrane potential is positive, right? Because you have more positive charge inside the cell compared to outside the cell. However, in real life, cells are not this simple, even just only looking at an electrical perspective. Why? Well, there's more than just one type of ion in a cell, right? Cells have potassium, sodium, calcium, chloride, tons of stuff. And all of these contribute to creating a membrane potential. And that sort of brings me to this big principle I want to talk about, which is, the big principle I want to talk about is both concentration gradients and electrostatic forces push ions, but concentration gradients have specificity. They are specific to each ion/solute in question. On the other hand, membrane potentials are an aggregate. They are equivalent to the difference in total charge on either side of a membrane, regardless of specific ion at play. What do I mean by that? Let me give you an example to explain. Let's say you have a cell, 100 K plus inside, 0 Na plus inside, 0 K plus outside, 100 Na plus outside. And I know it looks like NaT, not Na plus. My penmanship is atrocious. I apologize. I'm working on it. Will I improve? Unclear, but I know it's bad and I apologize. So again, back to business. Looking at this cell, what do we have? We have two strong concentration gradients, right? K wants to leave because concentration is much higher inside than outside. Na wants to enter, right? Because concentration is much higher outside compared to inside. And however, is there a membrane potential? No, because the charge, the aggregate charge inside is equivalent to the aggregate charge outside, regardless of the fact that that charge in this case is done by different ions, right? It doesn't matter that the positive is caused by K and the inside and positive is caused by Na outside. The fact that is the net aggregate charge is the same, so there's no membrane potential. And before the physicists / cell biologists / real experts come at me, membrane potentials are not just based on differences in charge. Yes, they are based also on permeability through the membrane. It also affects the membrane potential. So that's sort of the two parts of the electrochemical gradient, the two forces at play. You have the electrostatic repulsions that are based on differences in charge, and you also have the chemical force of diffusion based on a concentration gradient. Let's now talk about equilibrium potential. How do we calculate equilibrium potential? There's something called the Nernst equation, which is seen here at equilibrium. This is what the Nernst equation is. But for the purposes of looking at membranes and cells, this is a edit to that equation. Thank you to my professor, Professor Claypool. You can trust me, this is the same thing, right? We just changed log base E to log base 10, and we flip the signs and stuff because we want to have ion in over ion out. But in short, what is this? The equilibrium potential in volts or whatever unit of volts is equal to negative 2.3 times the gas constant times temperature in Kelvin over Z, the charge of the ion, times Faraday constant times the log base 10 of the fraction of concentration of ion inside over concentration of ion outside. And I know I just said like 1,000 words really quickly that mean nothing to you. Let me sort of explain through examples. But before I do that, I want to make one thing abundantly clear because this was very confusing to me. And I think this is what I believe to be a common misconception about equilibrium potentials. So I mentioned before about like electrostatic repulsions and force, right? About how that generates its own force that's separate but related to the concentration gradient, right? Based on the difference in charge on either side of the membrane. Equilibrium potential is not a measure of that electric potential force. Rather, it is the voltage necessary to oppose a concentration gradient. What do I mean by that? Let's look at potassium in the cell. In a real neuron, and I believe these figures are true, I think I pulled it from the NIH or something. K plus inside the cell is 120 micromolar, outside 4 micromolar. So if we plug these figures into the Nernst equation that we talked about here, and trust me, I'm doing a simplification of this term right here, this 2.3 RT over ZF, I can simplify that to negative 60 millivolts. Just trust me on that. You can do the math if you want and check me. Using that simplification, using the numbers we got from here, right, in these concentrations, we can go calculate the equilibrium potential of potassium using the Nernst equation, right? Negative 60 millivolts, which is simplification, times the log of concentration intracellular over extracellular. You get, using this math right here, you get negative 89, but in reality, the right answer is negative 90 because this is a simplification. All right, so this equilibrium potential for K of negative 90 millivolts, what does that mean? That does not tell you anything about the actual force caused by imbalance of charge, the electrostatic repulsive force. No, what that means is at negative 90 millivolts, and this concentration of calcium intracellular versus extracellular, goodness gracious, the force of electrostatic repulsion is enough to cancel out the force of diffusion of K plus down its concentration gradient, meaning that there is no net flow of K plus in or out of the cell. Why is that? Let's sort of think about what's happening at these conditions. What does negative 90 millivolts membrane potential mean? It means that the cell is inside negative compared to outside. What does K plus want to do if we're just looking at concentration gradients? It wants to leave the cell, right? Because it's very high concentration inside relative to concentration outside. It wants to leave the cell. But what would K plus leaving the cell do to a membrane potential? It would make it more negative. It would be less favorable, right? Because a positively charged cation leaving a cell makes the cell more negative, and it's already negative. And according to the Nernst equation, at negative 90 millivolts, that force of electrostatic repulsion, that desire to not make the cell more negative, is enough to compensate and counteract entirely the force that K plus exerts in its desire to move down its concentration gradient and leave the cell. So at negative 90 millivolts, it's called an equilibrium potential because the flow of K plus in or out of the cell is equilibrated. There is no net flow. So that's sort of the idea there. And that brings me to my next idea, this next big principle, which is that both concentration gradients and electrostatic forces push ions. We saw that here, right? There's two forces at play. The force to, cancel out this negative 9 millivolts, and also the force to, move K down its concentration gradient. However, compared to concentration gradients, membrane potentials and their attendant electrostatic forces form a smaller relative amount of ions moving across the membrane. As such, membrane potentials form faster. Everything, Ethan, okay, you just made an assertion. How do I know that's true? The answer to why what I said was true is math, because I'm bad at math and I already wasted enough time telling you that dumb story in the beginning, that dumb embarrassing story. I'm not going to do the math. Instead, if you want to do the math, here's the math you can do. Using Q equals CV and the capacitance of a membrane, you can, given a certain amount of voltage, you can solve for Q and convert to the number of potassium ions. But the takeaway, the take-home point, is that it only takes a fraction of a percent of the K plus ions in a cell to create about a 100 millivolt change in membrane potential. So what does that mean? It might take a lot, obviously, to create a concentration gradient, right? You need to make an actual significant difference in concentration intracellular versus extracellular. However, if you want to generate a membrane potential, you only need to move a fraction of a percent of the available K plus ions in a cell to create a pretty significant 100 millivolt membrane potential. And remember, that's a pretty significant potential because only negative 90 millivolts is required to oppose a concentration gradient that's already very significant, right? Negative 90 millivolts membrane potential is enough to oppose a concentration gradient of 120 micromoles to 4 micromoles. That's like 30x difference. So that concentration gradient forms fast. That membrane potential forms fast and is strong, right? So with that in mind, I'm going to talk about two examples to sort of illustrate all the concepts we talked about here. And this specific concept about the quickness and strength of membrane potential, I want to illustrate through the example of a lysosome. So what's a lysosome? A lysosome is an organelle in a cell that's really charged with breaking down waste products. Its characteristic properties at the intracellular pH, or not intracellular, the intralysosomal pH is very low compared to the cytosol. It's very acidic inside the lysosome. I should just speak like a normal person. It's very acidic inside the lysosome. And it's actually, the comparative acidity is pretty significant, right? In the lysosome, pH is 4.5 to 5. In the cytosol, pH is about 7.4. So if you don't remember what pH means, it's negative log of concentration of H plus. And I did the math here. The difference is about 250x concentration inside versus outside a lysosome. And you got to remember here, we're not talking about just a solid. We're not talking about sugar. We're talking about H plus, which is an ion. And you're telling me a lysosome was able to generate a difference of 250x inside versus outside? And well, hold on a second. I also just told you that only a fraction of a percent of the K plus ions in a cell can make a 100 millivolt membrane potential change. And that's pretty significant. A strong membrane potential change can be created by a fraction of a percent of ions. And Ethan, you're telling me that the lysosome moves a 250-fold change in ions inside versus outside? How does that happen? Well, you're right. That's an issue, right? How does that happen? The reality is the cell needs to account for that membrane potential change, and it does. There's two potential mechanisms, right? You can either move Cl minus, move an anion in as you move the H plus in, because remember, there's no specificity when it comes to these membrane potentials. As long as you're canceling out charge, that's all the membrane potential really cares about. That's what stops building up membrane potential. It doesn't actually care which specific ions you're using. So you move in an anion as you move in a cation, means there's no net charge change, or you move out a cation as you move in a cation, in this case H plus. And that's how you're able to acidify the lysosome. So in this case, when you're creating this highly acidified lysosome, you don't only have to think about the energy expenditure required to move H plus against concentration gradient, right? Because you're making the inside very acidic, making it very highly concentrated in H plus. You also have to account for the fact that moving in H plus means that you're moving in a cation, which means you're generating a membrane potential if you don't have another sort of corresponding anion or cation to counteract the change in charge. And the cell has to do that, because without that sort of counter ion movement, you're going to generate a large membrane potential, which will really make it hard to pump more H plus into that lysosome. So that's what the lysosome example. I hope that makes it very clear how these membrane potentials can form very fast with only a small amount of ions, how the cell compensates for that. I want to talk briefly about action potentials. This is not an action potential lecture, but I'm going to use the action potential to sort of illustrate some key points I talked about today. So in a neuron that's at resting membrane potential, chilling before an action potential, these are the sort of concentrations of sodium and potassium intracellular versus extracellular. So salty banana, right, is always that acronym or mnemonic or way of memorizing things. You have much higher sodium extracellular versus intracellular, and much higher potassium intracellular versus extracellular, just like a salty banana would. And the first thing I want to talk about, and what I've sort of mentioned before, is that membrane potentials rely on both a net difference in total charge and permeability, right? So it's not just as simple to think that membrane potentials are about difference in net charge. Permeability also plays a role. So if we look at the resting membrane potential of -75, that's actually closer to the equilibrium potential of potassium compared to sodium. The reason why is because natural potassium leak channels open here are a little more permeable to potassium compared to these sodium channels that are leaking in sodium into the cell, into the neuron. And that difference in permeability is generally what accounts for this resting membrane potential, which is closer to the equilibrium potential of potassium, because more potassium is able to go out because these channels are more permeable to that. And just as a reminder, this is sort of to be another reminder to what I was saying before, that again, membrane potentials are not just based on the difference in charge on either side of the membrane. There needs to be some permeability, right? That's important and something that I don't really go into. You can look at the GHK equation if you want, but that's just something to remember. Another thing I want to talk about: individual ion equilibrium potentials constrain total membrane potential achieved through diffusion. So remember, how do we find the individual ion equilibrium potential? Well, you go do the Nernst equation, right? So if we go back to our neuron, we can use these concentrations to find equilibrium potentials for each ion. And I've already given this to you. K plus is -90, we calculated that before, and Na plus is 65 millivolts. Why do I care about this? When we look at this cell, right, if we look at it simply through a concentration lens, when an action potential happens, when depolarization starts and these voltage-gated sodium channels open, from a concentration lens, what does the cell want to do? It wants to bring in a lot of sodium, right? It wants to equilibrate those concentrations on either side of the membrane. However, because we know the equilibrium potential of sodium is 65 millivolts, it doesn't matter how badly the sodium wants to get inside the cell. That diffusion of sodium inside the cell will stop once we reach a membrane potential of 65 millivolts, which is way up here, right? Even if sodium wants to diffuse in, it won't. And in a real action potential, those voltage-gated sodium channels do close at some point, right, to cause repolarization as those voltage-gated potassium channels open. But even if the voltage-gated sodium channels didn't close, at least for that moment, you wouldn't be able to actually get much more than 65 millivolts. You wouldn't get that much more diffusion because, again, of that equilibrium potential and what it does by constraining diffusion. That's the whole point of an equilibrium potential. At that voltage, you won't have any more net movement of the ion, right? So on both ends, on both the depolarization step and the repolarization step, the total membrane potential is constrained by the individual equilibrium potentials of the ions at play. The last thing I want to talk about, because this is a very long video, I do realize that. Thank you for staying with me if you're still here with me. The last thing I do want to talk about is about how the nerve cell is able to leverage both concentration gradients and electrostatic forces to quickly depolarize and repolarize. And to sort of explain this, I'm going to commit a cardinal PowerPoint sin. I'm going to put a ton of text on the screen and read off of it, but I think it's good because it's kind of hard to understand. By reading it and hearing it, perhaps you can understand it better. So what am I talking about? Looking at depolarization, as sodium channels open in depolarization, sodium flows inside the cell right here, right? And this movement inside the cell is propelled by two things. its concentration gradient, and the electric force / potential of a negative membrane potential. So what do I mean by that? That's the last part about electric force / potential. Remember, at a negative membrane potential, the cell is more negative inside than it is outside. So electrically, it's favorable for a positive cation to move in the cell to sort of counteract the negative charge. And that's what Na or sodium is. As those sodium channels open, there's two things pushing it. Obviously, it's concentration gradient, but also the electric charge issue, electric force / potential issue. So that ultimately, as Na plus rush in, you have enough Na plus to now create a positive membrane potential because these positive sodium ions increase their concentration intercellularly. So then when the potassium, the voltage-gated potassium channels open in repolarization, which is this step right here, potassium flows outside the cell. That's propelled by two things. One, its concentration gradient, because again, it's much more highly concentrated inside the cell compared to outside the cell. But also it's propelled by the electric force / potential of the positive membrane potential. What do I mean by that? Remember, at this point, you have a positive membrane potential, meaning the cell is more positive aggregate in an aggregate charge perspective. It's more positive inside than outside. From an electric perspective, it's favorable for positive ions to leave the cell to make the cell less positive or more negative. And that's what happens when those voltage-gated potassium channels open. They're pushed down their concentration gradient, but also by those electric forces / potentials. There's probably a real word to say, but I'm just making up all these words to sort of illustrate that force I want to get across. That's sort of the idea that I hope this concept of an action potential, this example of an action potential helps illustrate the concept of membrane potentials, right? All these factors work together and are very carefully orchestrated by cells and leveraged by cells in order to get their desired results, which in this case is an action potential, which in this case is the movement of a nerve impulse down a nerve and to do all the stuff that we like to do with our brains and nervous systems. As you can tell, I'm making mistakes. I'm getting tired. Thank goodness this is the end of the lecture. If you're still with me, thank you so much for hanging on. You've been very generous with time. I know this is long. Please feel free to provide feedback, questions, corrections, criticisms, suggestions, whatever it is. Let me know. This is still obviously a work in progress. I'm still working on it. This is far from perfect or far from even good, to be clear, but I'm working on it. And hopefully the next few lectures will be probably shorter and less all over the place. But hopefully you took something away from this, or maybe you were a little bit entertained by my dumb stories. Here are the citations for the lecture. And yeah, wish you the very best. Have a good day and take care. Bye-bye.